easiest if we just do 15-20 minutes and then we'll have the overall discussion. So you just note your questions and yeah, we'll have them afterwards. Yeah.
Great. So did you want to make a start, Noora, and then I'll pick up halfway through?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's do that. And so yeah, lovely to see you all. It's really, really nice to get back to this work. So we wrote this paper a couple of years ago, and so had a few discussions there and there, but it's always really, really good to hear your thoughts. And we are always open for discussion and debate in terms of where this could be going from here. And yeah, so just to give you the background, so with Gareth, we both work in sports science. I'm more in sport and exercise psychology. Gareth, broadly sport social sciences, sociology. And so why we came together first was that we did a critique of focused on validity in qualitative research. So we're both qualitative researchers, and it was basically a response to a paper in our field, which was really advocating for a more relativist understanding of validity or research quality or rigor. And so that was the starting point. We started working together. And so then a little bit as a next step from there, so we started thinking about data analysis. So Gareth was leading this work on thematic analysis. I was leading the previous paper on validity. And so in the same way as with the validity paper, so we wanted to look a little bit into what is the dominant perspective, what people are doing, and then what could a realist alternative look like. And so I think we'll start with, we have a slide on we go to the next slide. So a little bit about the background. So yeah, so there we are. And so when it looks, so thematic analysis is basically one of the most common ways that qualitative researchers work with their data. So even if you're doing other types of analysis, on top of it, often you start with some sort of thematization of the data. So it's a very basic approach that lots of qualitative researchers are doing in one way or another. And so what we were seeing is that there is really this sort of binary. So there are like two perspectives on thematic analysis. One is the Brown and Clark approach, which their new version is called reflexive thematic analysis, which they are positioning in what they call the qualitative paradigm. We don't really agree on how they define a qualitative paradigm either, but I guess that can be a discussion elsewhere. So it's more this sort of a more relativist approach. And then we have this codebook thematic analysis, which is a more neo-positivist in its orientation. And so basically, Brown and Clark is the go-to source when it comes to thematic analysis, and the paper in 2006, which is one of the most cited papers in psychology and qualitative literature in psychology. They were basically framing thematic analysis as being independent of theory and epistemology, so you can use it with whatever approach you're doing in terms of your theoretical orientations. But then as they are developing their approach, it's more and more going into what they call a qualitative paradigm. And so this is where we saw that some problems are arising. And so let's look a little bit in the next slide. So basically what Brown and Clark, they're contrasting their approach, which is this reflexive thematic analysis, with what they call the codebook approach. And they are saying that there are certain conflicts that are basically, it has to be one or the other. So either you're doing surface level versus deep level of analysis, either you are trying to or achieving richness and nuance in your data analysis, or then you're seeking consensus with different coders. And basically our question is that, do these actually have to be either or? So you can seek for richness and nuance, but you can also be seeking for consensus and have like critical debates with your colleagues or co-authors. And so Brown and Clark are really arguing against this sort of strong procedural focus. So what they're saying that if you're doing reflexive thematic analysis, it's not about the procedures. It's not about accurate or reliable coding, but it's about your reflective and thoughtful engagement with your data and the analytic process. But then asking also with our validity paper, the previous work we did, if you have various sorts of nuanced readings, thoughtful readings of the data, how are you going to sort out which one of them is going to feature in your research report? Or if you have a research team and all of them have different nuanced readings of the data, what are you going to do with them? And so this was one of the questions we were also asking. And so as you'll see, our approach then has a little bit of both. So what we are saying is that these two don't need to be either or. And so basically here is the summary of our approach that Gareth is going to run through in a moment. And so with okay, that's the baby, I think. You might have heard that. You're basically probably aware of the iceberg model. So this paper from Amber Fletcher. And so there used, that's the critical realist stratified ontology. And we were trying to map the steps of our data analysis with this stratified ontology. So first, if you look at the empirical themes, at the empirical level, that's where we are coding for the intentions, hopes, concerns, beliefs, and feelings captured in the data. We're not sure if this is the exhaustive list, so this can be discussed further. Then from the experiential themes, once you've developed them, then you're jumping to inferential themes, which are those inferences and conceptual redescriptions that you are doing from your experiential themes. And then finally, you are moving to dispositional themes that are about the theories about properties that must exist for you to be observing what you are observing. And so now next we have the flower, which is Gareth's alternative metaphor. And so I'll hand it over to him now.
Yeah, I think we were probably overly proud of this when we were talking about it, given it's just a flower. But yeah, other people in the critical realist world have sort of been saying they're a bit bored of the iceberg metaphor. So I guess the idea with all this really, and it's a pretty crucial part of the analysis, is to rather than just looking at your data and trying to basically thematize things, which is put things in categories, it's helpful to almost categorize the categories in a way. So you're thinking of the different levels of things in your data. So that's the point of the experiential, inferential, and dispositional themes, and it does map on nicely to that critical realist ontological depth. So with the flower, we have the petals, and the pollen that we can see there is things that we can see, and that's observable to us, and you wouldn't really get much disagreement between different readers, different analysts on what's going on. And I think that works with the social world. There are some things that people, once you really think about it, there's not going to be too much disagreement on. But there are also things that are not going to be observable to us in our studies. So if you think of the stem of the flower as being like that, then we would be able to see it if we were to sort of move our heads and look from a different angle. So it is, in principle, it is observable, but we just don't happen to have it in our view in the data we've got and the things that are observable to us. But then the third level is we've conceptualized that as the kind of soil that is in the ground. So even if we were to move our head, we still wouldn't be able to see that at all. So visually thinking this as a metaphor, no matter what perspective we were looking at the flower from, we still wouldn't be able to see that stuff. However, we can see from this nice flower here that we can kind of infer that there's probably some nutrients in the soil, that it has got enough moisture and it has got the things that it needs to grow. But we're inferring that, and we're having to rely on theory and our understanding of it to come to that conclusion. So that's the sort of different levels. So applying that to themes essentially is what we try to do. And when you're doing some qualitative analysis, maybe there's some things that that can be applied to. So the other really useful thing that we try to bring in that we don't see that much of in our view in the other types of thematic analysis is a discussion on different types of reasoning, and there's kind of some slightly different definitions and different uses of these terms, but to us we thought that different types of reasoning all probably have different values to them, and so we might talk about deductive reasoning, so testing the truth of an emerging premise based on the truth of an observable conclusion. Inductive reasoning being something different, but then crucially I think what we're doing differently to the likes of Brown and Clark is bringing in these ideas that we get from critical realism, and in particular this paper by this book by Danemark and colleagues. So this abductive reasoning, which is essentially this redescription, and this retroductive, which is the theorizing about the potential powers that must exist in the world in order for the phenomenon of the world to manifest. So this is probably more causal thinking as opposed to abductive, is that conceptualizing. Now I think implicitly a lot of good analysis would do all of these things, but so part of this thinking through this was trying to almost be a bit more explicit. And in my experience doing other types of thematic analysis, I do find it really, really difficult to kind of to figure out where a kind of a better interpretation or a better analysis comes from. And there's almost like stronger academics can kind of do it quite well, and they really struggle to explain how they're doing it. So I think part of this was actually trying to think, well, actually, what happens in those, in terms of that thought process, in terms of that reasoning, what happens with a stronger analysis, and can we bring that explicitly into a process? So that's what we did, and we were kind of, we had these ideas, and like most papers, we kind of, during the process of writing, we were developing these ideas, and we were working through some data that Noora had from a previous study. So just to give some context, because that'll help these illustrative examples kind of makes more sense. Noora's study was on sports coaches, and essentially asking them what their experiences of sports coaching are like, why they do it, and asking some of the questions about their background, their life histories. So kind of narrative interview where people are talking about their past, present, and future with their experience with sports coaching. One of these questions was, why do coaches begin, maintain, and discontinue in sports coaching? This has been, people have come back to us, and while we're thinking about it, yes, it's the kind of sports domain, but it also applies to lots of other kind of voluntary positions across lots of domains in society as well. So as an example of these experiential themes, what do they look like when we're when we developed them. So observed experiences and events in the empirical domain. What we tried to do was we tried to pick up, and Noora mentioned this already, we tried to like focus on these things of intentions, hopes, concerns, feelings, and beliefs. So using their language that we would use in the interview, could we kind of redescribe what someone says? And there's a little bit of influence going on there. You know, so we'll all do this all the time. We might not use the words I intend, I hope, I'm concerned about, but we'd kind of create a sentence based on those ideas, because these are the things that we think are the top level, the petals and the pollen that we can actually see if we've conducted the interview well. And then to enhance the rigor, there's kind of various things that we can do there as well. We found it really useful to kind of work between each other to really kind of press down, what are they saying here, what are they hoping, what are they concerned about, and really clarify those sentences. We formatted it in a way where we actually used Excel. We found that as a really useful tool, and we can kind of work horizontally and vertically across various things that are kind of coming out. So you can see in the top half of the screen then transcript 1, and we'd essentially populate this as we go. So this, the first participant expressed that, and we use these sentence starters as well. We found this really useful. The participant expressed that he felt inspired to coach by his own experience of being coached himself. And then we included an illustrative data extract in there. And we'd have an argument a little bit about what that meant, and you know, can we clarify what the participant is expressing? But we would essentially develop that. And then what we do is, once we've got that nice and clear, can you then check transcript 2 from another participant and see whether there is the same thing is being expressed? So over time, we get to develop that a little bit. And then we also, on the far left-hand column, on the top half of the screen, we can make a comment on across all the participants in the data set. So essentially what you end up with is a fairly long list, but it can be reduced depending on what you're interested in, of things that the participants in your study are expressing. So that's fairly empirical. That's probably where the neo-positivist kind of codebook approach might stop. But the next level that we do see in the more qualitative tradition, where we're leaning into interpretation, is this idea of abduction, where we're conceptually redescribing things in more abstract language. So there's the description there. This is all copy and pasted from the paper, so sorry, it's quite sort of text heavy, but I'll just sort of skim through that just to kind of get an idea. So the inferential themes then are a little bit different. So we go from those clear statements about what the coach is expressing to more plausible claims that are conceptually redescribed. So if you just look at the top left, then it's plausible to claim that coaches could have felt inspired to coach by their PE teachers. So at times when it didn't seem to be that there wasn't a redescription necessary, then we didn't do much with it. But other times we would do more with it. So we would record this refinement decision, and as we move horizontally across, we thought this was about role models and role modeling. So coaches, it's plausible to claim that coaches could have considered a PE teacher as a role model. So simply bringing in language that wasn't used in the interview, this is where we're kind of doing our conceptual work as sort of people who've been reading conceptually in the literature. As you can see, the shorthand labels on the right hand side begin to kind of be developed through this stage of the thinking. So we're moving from clear things that are observable to things that are maybe less observable, and we're making a conceptual inference here. And the final level of things that we're trying to do in this process is to think more causally, thinking with this retroductive reasoning, to create theories about the properties that must exist in order to produce the phenomenon being studied. So it's kind of an interesting discussion, just because sometimes some interviewees can start to theorize themselves. So that's a little bit tricky, and we talked quite a bit about that, especially one of the reviewers kind of brought it up during the review process. It's a really good point. And for us, look, that's absolutely great. If you happen to be interviewing someone who is conceptually redescribing and they're also doing some explanations, that's great. But the point is, this is the next level, or another part of the process. So the sentence starters for this is more like the inferred phenomena is dependent upon the existence of ... So what is it dependent on? So we think there are maybe young people's dispositions to emulate others who are socially and culturally well positioned in their cultural network. So you can see on the left-hand column, that was one of us. So I can't remember who, but let's say that's myself. And then independently, Noora came up with a different kind of disposition, a different kind of causally related thing. Available narrative resources provided by others that guide people's lives. So we kind of combine both of them, maybe have an argument if we needed to, and then kind of mature that in, maybe combine them, maybe add them together, and have something a little bit later. So we developed from that. Then the kind of example I've been using throughout is this role modeling. You know, a coach going into coaching because they appreciated their PE teacher did it in school, calling that role modeling, and now saying that we've got this disposition in us to emulate others, and we have these narrative resources as well. So the mature dispositional theme there is to say that the inferred phenomenon is dependent on the existence of young people's disposition to draw on the available narrative resources provided by others who are meaningfully positioned in their lives. So you can see how that's you know, it's not empirically observed as a research claim. Then that's clearly grounded in the data, but it's been reconceptualized, and then it's also been looked at as a disposition. So looking at what's beneath, potentially causally contributing to that experience. So ultimately, then we have a list of empirical themes, inferential themes, and dispositional themes at the end. And then what we do at the end of that was just to kind of maybe check whether that works, is rephrase that as an explanatory statement, and essentially reversing the order that you do it in. So it's a bit wordy to talk through it now, but you essentially can say, grammatically, it kind of makes sense to say, because of the existence of X, there may be a tendency that Y, and this manifested in our data, which showed that Z. So that kind of, if that starts to make sense to you as an analyst, and you can kind of see that there are these dispositions in the world, within us or within society, they lead to a tendency of these things happening, and we can reconceptualize that. And then finally, give an example in your data of how that actually manifests in your real life. So you go all the way from the soil, the nutrients, and the water that kind of need to be there, to the things that we can't necessarily observe, but we're inferring, all the way to the things that you can actually observe in your data. And that's where we finish. Yeah, so I think we kind of wanted to talk for about that long. We can kind of reflect a little bit on what's happened since writing the paper. But I think for now it's probably good to kind of open it up to everyone, and yeah, hear what you think, and discuss some of the things maybe we haven't gone into. How's that, Mark?
That was thank you for both of you. I really appreciate it. Very, very interesting. You know, I'm actually, for myself, going into analysing my 85 narrative interviews, so I will want to watch this a few times. That's when that soak in, but. I think initially, if I was going to throw a question out, I mean, why did you choose narrative over semi-structured interviews?
In my broader project, yeah. So basically, that study existed before we started doing the thematic analysis work. So we just looked into, we were considering that we're using some data set that I've collected, or Gareth, or are we trying to look into some repositories? And so basically for the sport coach study, so there the idea was life history oriented approach to understand careers, how they evolve, what are the turning points in coaches' careers, and so on. So that was not related really to our we did like a new analysis, and in my previous work with the data set, I'd worked with the narrative analysis approach. Yeah.
Because I've used narrative for my interviews and based that on Holloway and Jefferson's. They talk about a defended subject, where so I'm interviewing police officers who are very cynical and are very defensive. So out of that kind of narrative can leak or seek sort of unconscious causation. So using your your journal that frames that just excellently, excellent for me. But yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your presentation, guys. Is there anybody else like to ask a question at all? Adam?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed that. And it's apart from anything else, we've been struggling for many years to know how to communicate these ideas to students. And I think the flower metaphor is really beautiful, to absorb it. So thank you for that. Of course, the old iceberg metaphor never goes away. But I really like that the idea of the soil and so on, the nutrients and the observable, the unobservable is really great. And I was just actually, Mark started to allude to that. I mean, the way in which one elicits observations in ways which are more or less open to causal inference, I think, is very interesting, isn't it? The narrative interview. Rather than the semi-structured one, I think of getting behind the defended subjects is a very, we're always grappling, I think, as realists with this a problem of placing some conceptual order onto things, but at how soon, and in ways which kind of drive us in a particular direction, but might be blinkered. Yeah, because this is always the objection, isn't it, of grounded theorists and so on, more empiricists that and more overtly inductive thinkers, is that driving things through more tightly defined theoretical propositions can blink you to these things, and you miss things in the data, and that is actually traducing reality and causes. Those are just my observations. Starting off with the role of different kinds of qualitative inquiry and how they elicit things which may seem to be inductive, but then how you kind of, I think, very powerfully reconceptualize those. So I think even nor if it was happen chance that it was narrative rather than a deliberately something you deliberately set out of, even so, I think there is something very strong about the unstructured narrative interview as helping us kind of grapple with that idea of the blinkers, the problem of in extremis hypothetico-deductive approaches to that. Okay, but in ways which still help us use theoretical propositions to infer the real and the actual triggering of the relationship between them. But no, and it's a terrific article. I think very useful for to begin to communicate some of these ideas to undergraduates, let alone kind of fellow researchers. So thank you for that. I thought that was very neat. The only other point I would make, and then I'll hand it over, is that in terms of the difference between, obviously, once it's the observable. Is that obviously which the respondents are through their own narratives giving you, okay, and the inference, and then the dispositions and the movement between those is quite interesting, isn't it? So I briefly caught some of your example into the one column. You've got something like excellence. How would you differentiate that from from some of the categories that you're using in your final disposition? As a causal and sorting that. That's the only kind of query I had. But really, very stimulating.
Yeah, Well, yeah, just a couple of things to respond to that. I look forward to hearing Stephanie's questions as well, but just while it's in my mind, yeah, it certainly makes me think a little bit about the common good practice in qualitative work in my field in relation to how theory is used. So in my own work and in the papers that I love reading, theory is usually set out from the start of the paper as the lens that's being used. I don't know whether this is the same in your fields as well, but it's a Borgesian analysis of such and such, or it's a Deleuzian analysis of such and such. And these are great papers, fantastic to read. But I think there is this, when going through this process, it undermines that quite a lot. And I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing in a way. Obviously, sort of, I think a hardcore scientist would say that if you're starting with theory as a lens, it's probably problematic because you're kind of defining your conclusions from the start. But leaving theory till later, like we do in this approach, almost means you get a kind of mix and match of different sort of theoretical ideas just sort of coming through when you start talking about different concepts, and when you're talking about the dispositional levels as well. Other kind of you're trying to draw on just a big array of different theoretical perspectives in order to help you understand what's going on. So potentially then you might be losing some kind of coherence that you get in those other papers that I'm talking about, where you begin with this sort of established framework. So I think that's an interesting kind of sort of discussion point on this approach. But yeah, and I totally take your point on the not sure what Noora thinks here, but on the difference between the concepts you use at the inferential level and the theory you use in the dispositional level. I think sometimes it might be that that's how we're framing it in our heads. So at the moment I've got I'm resting this laptop on a chair that's in front of me, and it's easy to think sometimes the chair might just be a conceptualization of something, but in this moment it's kind of causally important to hold my computer up. So yeah, I might want to frame. It might be the framing that gives it, that I want to give it a kind of dispositional property, as opposed to a conceptual description, as it were. So yeah, because I think excellence could be in one way a description, but excellence could also be causally relevant in another view. So I do think that's an interesting point, and I wonder whether that's just part of how we're framing it as a heuristic.
But if I could just come in back on that point, Gareth. So, but I like that distinction actually, because in one sense, what you're trying to develop a hierarchy. The excellence actually more fundamentally underpin that is the pursuit is some notion of achievement. That's the kind of necessary a condition for people talking about excellence. Yeah. As opposed to mediocrity, for example, in pursuing a sports coaching career, is because they're fundamentally driven by a notion of achievement. And we can argue and debate that relationship, but what's really useful for that is that you're building those kind of hierarchy of concepts, which then helps us develop that point. And so what I really like to see is the idea, Derek Lader's idea of adaptive theory. Which is, I think, is one way of trying to navigate our route through, the blinkers, if you like, or confirmation bias, as some would say, on the one hand, and then being too much driven by the categories and arguments of your respondents, which is always the kind of danger of the grounded theoretical approach. It's that we work with theoretical propositions, but they're open to revision and adaptation in the doing of it. And I think what you're setting out there is a more kind of granular set of procedures that researchers new to these arguments could alight upon. What I really liked about your paper is it's a kind of how-to. This is how you set out your ideas. If you're trying to explain it to people who are not as versed in CR as we are, how can I actually do that? I thought it was a very, very neat way. It's a very usable set of matrices that where you can begin to illustrate that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, maybe just to add, when it comes to theory, that if you looked at the dispositional themes, and it was, some of those were clearly from narrative theory, so narrative resources is a much used concept. Then I'm using like existential philosophy and psychology in my work. So we were talking about these projects and serious commitments and concernful involvement. So that's kind of the conceptual background where this work, where that comes from. So obviously we are always like, when we are finally moving to those dispositional themes, we are using that conceptual tools that we have. And so obviously everybody has their favorite theories, and they start to see things through that theory. And so what was quite useful for us was that, because we work with a little bit different traditions, and it was really interesting to see how, when we actually spend a lot of time with the same data, and how we are coming up with different conceptual redescriptions. And this is often what you don't get to do, because often PhD students, for example, work with their data, and the supervisor will read the draft, but like not really work on the data from the start and the actual transcript. So that was really a good experience, I think, for both of us. And when often it's, for example, with Maxwell's validity concept, he talks about theoretical validity and how you should be testing different sort of theoretical readings and put them in competition and see which one seems to work better. And so in reality, you just never do that. But so this paper gave us the good chance of like using different concepts and then debating and discussing them, and how it gives you a different reading of what's going on.
Lovely, thank you, Noora. Stephanie, you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, firstly, thank you both of you for your papers. I'm third year PhD student. This was really very good timing for me. You know, just at the point where my supervisors are going, but how do critical realists analyze data? I was like, I don't know. So yeah, a personal thanks. And I think you rightly should be proud of the flower metaphor, because it was, you know, in critical realism, there's so many massive ideas to get your head round, and that was just a really nice, simple, you know, I kept coming back to the little picture and going, okay, this bit's that. Yeah, I wondered about what's happened since, because in the paper you said you'd only used 2 interviews for the analysis, and I wondered if you've had a chance to use this kind of approach with more data since then, and what you learned from that. And I think partly in light of when I was doing my data analysis, mine's never neat like everybody else's seems to be, and I had like 90 codes at one point, and you know, the same quote that fits in 3 or 4 different places and so on. So I'm just interested in how you manage that. And then I've got a very cheeky second question, because I wonder what you think about Tom Fryer's paper that came after yours, that he sort of built on what you did, and I'd be interested to know what your response is to that if you've read it. Thank you.
So I'll take the easy one, which is the first one. And so that was one of our thoughts as well, that, yeah, like you said, it's 2 interviews, but then like when you have 15 or 20 or however many you have, then it easily blows up completely, and you have 200 different codes. And so we don't really have an answer to that, because we didn't do any data analysis with the full data set yet. And so this is a good reason to be presenting the work, in terms of, did anyone try to do that? Like, how did it work for you? Did it not work for you? And if it certainly doesn't work for you, then there's probably some refinement that needs to be done. But so far, we didn't try to do that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So I mean, that is a question. Has anyone here gone through the process with their own data yet, Mark? I know you've worked with it in your MSc. Did you kind of follow it all the way through, or?
Yeah, it did work for me. I find it's easy when you're looking at the flower head. As you're going down the stem into the roots, that's for me when it gets more complex. And like me and Orlando were having a conversation the other day. The abstraction is hard. It's hard intellectual laboring. It's difficult, and what I found with my MSc is 17 police officers, so there's a reasonable database for masters. That what officers were speaking about when they were talking about their mental health, it related to control, and you can link, I managed to sort of link that into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We all need a kind of base of control. You need food in your fridge, you need roof, when that control was taken away from officers because there's a lot of ambiguity in the role, that made them very, very ill. There were different things that came in. So the flower and that analogy or the iceberg worked really well. But very, very, I think as you're going from the empirical to the real, that's when the hard work really starts. And I don't think I've got that sus quite yet, even though I managed to work from MSc. I think Orlando was talking about going back to Marx and some of that kind of dialectics and how you go through the relations, causal relations and stuff. Tricky, to be honest with you, Gareth.
Yeah, I mean,
and also with sampling, if you're going to interview 17 flowers, well, which flowers do you pick? Because the roots might have very different soil, and you can't actually see that bit. So that that for me is still, I'm still thinking about, really, even though I've collected my data set.
Yeah, no. So we are really interested in seeing how other people have used it, and because we have probably had intended at this point to have used it in a full data set as opposed to just developing the idea. But we've got COVID and new jobs, and Noora's been producing humans and these things. So so kind of, but I mean, it has been kind of picked up. So citations wise and reads, it's sort of a lot been more kind of widely looked at than my other work, and similar sort of story with Noora as well. So I was looking earlier today, I was kind of scrolling through Google Scholar, looking at sort of citations and clicking through, and a lot of them are kind of people who are just doing a thematic analysis, but they just chuck in a latest reference because it's a newer reference. Some people have kind of picked up like maybe one aspect of it. So they like the idea of validity, or they say they've kind of got a realist kind of paradigmatic kind of inclination, and that's how they brought it in, but they haven't gone through the whole process. And then I saw one that is really picked up on the quantitative aspect that this allows. So you can count how many of your participants have expressed, that first sort of theme. So I found one paper that essentially went through that whole process, but didn't really go any further in terms of theorizing. So they really lent in on that one aspect. And then I got bored after around the fifth page on Google Scholar. But so I think a couple of people are starting to use it, but it does take time because you probably need to get a PhD student to be working with it, and then for that work to kind of come through and get published takes years. So I think there has been a good amount of engagement with it, and even if people are kind of picking up on a few, and we've done several of these sort of conversations, and we've responded to quite a lot of emails of people asking us different sort of questions and things, and how to use it and have I done it right. But yeah, we've certainly we've had questions ourselves, particularly around how the list expands, potentially whether the dispositional list expands larger as well. Those kinds of things can be quite tricky. But we're just really open to other people now, sort of trying it out, adapting it, refining it, and sort of taking it on if there's any bits of it that are useful. then move on. I have to say, for me, the useful things that I want to do is really categorizing what themes. So you're thinking through the flower, but also the sentence starters have been were a really clear thing for me, to say, like, this participant expressed that, or this participant is concerned about, this participant is whatever. That really helps you sort of think through, what you're actually trying to say, rather than a thematic analysis where sometimes it just ends up being, just categories and just a wild, overwhelming sense of different concepts and trying to figure out what's going on. And then, in terms of Tom Fryer, so I know Tom. He's sort of a really good person to have around and be able to chat to, so in that paper he's explicitly sort of saying, positioning it in the same way that we did. There's this binary conception of thematic analysis. One's quite qualitative heavy, and one's quite neo-positivist. So we need to maybe do something in the middle, which is the critical realist take. And essentially, I think what his approach is pretty similar in stages to the Brown and Clark's kind of 6-step model, except that the real key punchy point is that you're looking for explanations, and that's, I think he's tried to kind of probably make it more accessible, less arduous. I think he's probably looked at the process that we've talked through today and said, well, is it realistic to be able to do that with all, with every single theme? Does that put people off? The level of complexity. So maybe we can achieve some of the basic critical realist ideas of kind of looking for those causal dispositions in a simpler kind of approach. So no, I don't think we're kind of in conflict with each other at all in those different approaches. I think as one's probably you could kind of get to a similar conclusion probably through a simpler way. Ours is probably a bit more step-by-step kind of mechanical way of getting there. But yeah, no, I think Tom's paper is excellent, and really the same sort of thrust, the same spirit really has gone into it, I'd say. Does that help, Stephanie? Did you have any thoughts on what's happened since, or that Tom Fryer's paper? Or
well, so I used kind of, it's very reassuring to me to hear what you just said about, well, take bits that are useful, because that's exactly what I did. So I took bits from yours and bits from the Tom Fryer paper, and then I just had a go. So I had 20 interviews. I guess there was a point where my supervisors were like, okay, so how did you get from all your themes to, or your codes to your themes? And I was like, I cried in the kitchen quite a lot, and then so, which apparently isn't a Viva answer. But so I think there was still, at some point, there still almost is that kind of magical leap somewhere between, okay, so I've done all this really systematic stuff with all my data and it's all neatly labeled. Now at some point I still have to kind of make a bit of a conceptual leap to go, okay, here's what I think it's actually saying. But I think that's always involved in that process anyway. A practical thing, I tried the sentence starters, but then because I was using NVivo, they're just too long. And because it puts everything in alphabetical order and you can see the first few words, it just meant your column is exactly the same for every, so I had to abandon that in order to make NVivo work. So that's that's just a practical tip there. But yeah, absolutely, I did as you suggested, and I just took the bits that felt helpful from both papers, and then just had a go, and I've done something that's probably not that true to either, but they were my starting point. So yeah, thank you.
Adam, you got your hand up.
Yes, thanks. So we've largely been talking about interviews, whether narrative, more or less structured, semi-structured, unstructured, but with individuals. Yeah. Do you think you could transpose this approach to focus groups or to textual analysis of documents and such like? Would that be the intention?
Yeah, that's certainly been a recent email of someone actually. It was, can we use this for focus groups? And yeah, there's no reason why not. But I think I remember responding saying it's interesting whether you create a new column per person or you create because our columns are basically participant A is concerned about thing. Yeah. Or do you create it? Are people speaking on behalf of the focus group? Are your comments about the focus group? So cancer patients or police officers who've just retired in this focus group generally are concerned about such and such. So are you speaking generally on people or not? So I think that'll be the main difference.
But because some would argue that. In terms of construct validation, that can occur by passing transcripts or summaries of transcripts of interviews to other interviewees, or other key informants in that area. And this way of rendering subjective accounts more objective. So I think it's quite an interesting realist approach. But the issue of the focus group is in one sense it kind of wraps that up into the initial exchange, right? Particularly it works especially well, and you've got participants who are correcting or challenging or then are arriving at an agreed position. So respondent and construct validation is wrapped into those kinds of non-individuated qualitative inquiries. So which I say that by way of, I think that further strengthens your argument. Do you see what I mean? With and that kind of realist search, which is why I think it's kind of useful to think about transposing what you've argued into other kinds of data, qualitative data collection methods. I've also done work in the past on policy Delphi deliberations, which are sort of asynchronous, anonymous exchanges, but again, which move over iterative rounds. It's a way of, again, of folding respondent and construct validation into the actual method rather than something you do subsequently with a cache, if you like, or a whole catalogue of individualized transcripts. So, but I think so. I think the nature of the qualitative inquiry is also germane for realists in terms of grappling with this movement between the subjective and the objective. And I think there are ways of drawing upon these, which aren't necessarily overtly realist methods, but within the broader qualitative canon, but which nonetheless could be deployed, I think, to substantiate and develop your argument about how you then conceptualize and work with that kind of data. So in your categories, then the experience and inference, the inference in one sense can be wrapped up with some methods, in terms of the focus group discussion or the policy Delphi deliberation and such like.
Yeah. And I do think that there's a place for it in document analysis as well. I guess you're just changing the ideas of this organization. What's that organization trying to say, or what's that newspaper tending to say, or what's that author, if it's a book, autobiographical book, what are they expressing in their work. So yeah, I think that there's different ways of doing it, and it could work.
Okay, Rachel, I think you've got a question.
I do. Thanks, Mark. I'm so stupid. I can't even work out how to do the thumbs up. I was just sat here going, yeah, I'm like a nan. Sorry, Mark, you're going to have to edit all this out again every time I open my mouth. I think I was really interested in the idea of using it for document analysis. I have been working on a project for a few years doing child and adult and domestic homicide reviews, so serious case reviews. And we do this, there's 4 members of the team, different backgrounds. So I think it does very much follow the kind of logic you're talking about. But my question really is about how you reconcile disagreements, because I noticed, I think Noora mentioned, kind of arguments, and I wonder how you deal with that, because I know we had I'm turning into one of those really awful people who ask questions to talk about themselves. But how do you reconcile when I know I've sat there and felt really strongly that I could see that I think it was fair to suggest that there was something going on that I couldn't, because we look at lots of they're serious case review files, are very long, quite gritty. I'm quite, and then I sat down with the others who were like, well, no, because they come at it in a different way. And I just wondered how you kind of arrive at an agreement, I think.
Yeah, so there were some points that we were debating, and I mean, quite a lot of the experiential themes were just actually not so difficult, because then you go back to, we both read what the participant is saying there, and then we start debating. And sometimes it was really easy that one of us coded PE teacher and one of us coded coach. Then we went back, what did the person actually say? And okay, we saw it was a PE teacher, and one of us just made a mistake. And those were like the more straightforward ones, like no debate. Some situations I was the one who had interviewed the people, and so then I knew much more about the context, and so then I could maybe fill in some things, or I'd be working on the data, and then I could say that actually in the other part of the interview there's something else that kind of complements the story, what's going on here, so we could take a look at the other part of the interview. But so I think, yeah, most of the time, and then it came down to when we're moving to the inferential and dispositional themes, then it comes down to debating the different theoretical perspectives, right?
Yeah.
But so I guess one important point is that the person who did the interview is obviously going to know much more about the participant, and they probably know some background. So we had a different file, which is about the background information of the participant as well. And then sometimes, like knowing more about the context, the one who did the interviews can maybe fill in some parts, and then maybe it's like easier to come like with that information. Maybe the person who did the interviews will have a stronger interpretation in some cases, not every, and sometimes it's really good for somebody who doesn't know anything about the person to take a fresh look. But so I think so. We had some discussions, and we had like the different concepts we were using, but I think at the end we didn't end up like disagreeing on anything at the end of the day. Am I right, Gareth? Like,
yeah, I think it's almost more that
yeah.
Our first kind of our go-to concepts were different to begin with. So when you're independent, you kind of go to the things that you know, that you sort of learn a little bit more. But so then when we come back together, then that ended up not really being in conflict. They were just sort of different descriptions of the same thing. So in that case, we try and combine sort of both of them in the more mature theme. But yeah, I mean, I would say that, you know, it's important to kind of have, yeah, if you think, Rachel, that you've kind of got a strong view of what you think's going on, then, you know, it's obviously important space to kind of have that conversation. And it's helpful that Noora and I kind of work well together. So I'd imagine if we didn't, you know, if there was like a power imbalance, or we disagreed like most of the time or something like that, I think it would be really difficult to go through this process. But, you know, I think that's, yeah, I think that's a kind of personality thing, or almost, and a process of like, you know, being willing to sort of be challenged, and working with people like that, I think is quite important. Because I can see it being a sort of pointless process with some people. I don't know whether you've had these sort of conversations before, where it's just like, yeah, it's kind of like, you know, someone's just not willing to sort of listen to an alternative view or whatever. But yeah, I would totally agree with Noora. The experiential themes were easy, and we did pick up on mistakes that we'd made. in the initial transcripts, and sometimes I find them actually when I'm writing a paper, I kind of get to that level and realize I've made a mistake, or I'm trying to publish it, and there's sometimes when you sort of you're a little bit quiet about the thing that they said earlier in the interview that was like that kind of contradicted the point, and you've got those incentives because you want to publish the paper, so you keep quiet about the thing that's contradictory. So it's just having someone else there to kind of challenge that, and taking the right attitude towards these conversations, and working with someone who, I don't know, I've heard before in writing that you should work with people who you agree with 80% of the time and then disagree with 20% of the time. That's a kind of good balance. So you're kind of you're used to challenging each other, right? Because if you're 100% agreeing the whole time, then you're not really getting a different perspective. But if you're disagreeing all the time, then it would end up being sort of too bad. So I don't know. I think we're probably more like 90-10, aren't we, Noora? So we need to disagree more.
Yeah, maybe. But we also discussed during the process, like when you are then reading the transcript, and what are the hopes, what are the concerns of this person, is that when you're doing the actual interview, that it's so valuable that you are like trying to summarize and like, so is this what you meant? So have I understood it correctly, that this and that? And so a sort of member checking as you're going. So if you're not like for interpretive validity as well, that you are trying to get the sense and really check that, are we on the same page, that this is what you're telling me here. And so if you're not sure at the point when you're doing the interview, then you're maybe going to have some challenges later on when you're working with the transcript. Then I don't know, with some people maybe like they are joking half of the time, and then when you're just reading the transcript and don't know the context, then you can be like pretty confused, like what's going on in this interview. So being able to do this sort of checking during the actual interview is going to make your life a little bit easier later on.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Has anybody got any other questions at all?
I was about to say, Mark, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to dash off in a moment. So yeah, if there's, sorry to cut that. Sort of
No. Well, we'll if anybody's got any more questions, we'll happily end it there. I mean, thank you very much, both of you. It's been a really enjoyable. Sorry, Adam, you had a.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I hope we can keep in touch. I mean, our focus is very much criminological, crime, security, justice issues, but you're more than welcome to come along, and hopefully some of these discussions. I'm very interested to use your approach. I got 15 focus groups I did on intelligence exchange around organized crime between the police, probation, and the prison services. Enormous amount of stuff, but to try and move between the experience of what they think intelligence is and what they think the problem is, and how one might, infer from that really, what are their dispositional views about the world and their concepts of justice and so on. So I mean, I think that's it will be of interest to you. So even if it's not empirically your area, I'd imagine a lot of us here work with qualitative approaches as well. So would be delighted, and Stephanie, also you, please do feel you come along, even if it's the empirical isn't this of interest. Our discussion of the actual and real kind of mechanism of generating that may be of interest to you in these methods. So I'd be really delighted, and thank you to Mark for coordinating these sessions and for inviting you three along, and please. Mark, we're able to put Noora, Gareth, and Stephanie on the circulation list?
Of course we can. Yeah.
So we try and meet once a month. So last Wednesday of the month, as it were. So if you wanted a home for discussion, wrap up some ideas methodologically, we're here for you as well. So it's important to support each other in this in our philosophical approach. So. That's really what I wanted to say, and thanks ever so much. Very stimulating session this evening, and to everyone for supporting the network.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Yeah, thanks for all the good questions and comments. Yeah.